What's going on YouTube? Kronos here, and welcome to my bouncer guide. But before we jump into this, I want to get a couple of things out of the way, just a few quick disclaimers. First and foremost, I am not the end-all be-all when it comes to information on bouncer, so there might be a few things I miss here and there, or maybe some specifics that we didn't go to in this guide itself. Feel free to toss those into the comments below. Second kind of goes off of that as well. The whole point of this guide is not a theory crafting video. It's not to give you every single scenario on how to play bouncer. It is to get you started with playing bouncer overall. I look at it as an average player's guide. My goal here is to help you guys not be bad. I know it seems a little silly, but realistically speaking, as far as when I pick up a class or start playing a game, my goal is how to not be bad with that class itself before how to get extremely good. I feel like it's the best place to start and the way that we should look at guides moving forward, at least on this channel. So just to give you guys kind of a outline of how the video itself is going to go, we're going to cover classes, we're going to cover the skill trees, and then we're going to cover the individual weapons. I'm going to do equipment videos separate just because they change. They tend to change some of the most. So either way, let's go ahead and jump into this. So for main class, at least for me, whenever I'm playing bouncer, my subclass choices, realistically speaking, are going to be one of three. Either you look at fighter, you look at gunner, or you look at force. And the reason behind it is just because of one being damage. Fighter as a subclass goes really well with bouncer when it comes to just down damage. Since bouncer has some pretty good synergy with helping cause downs, fighter getting extra damage while a target is down just works very well. So I mean, it's that primarily being the only choice when it comes to extra damage in any of the skill trees anyway, so it just tends to be the choice most people go with for raw damage overall. For the other two choices, you've got gunner. Gunner and force. It's just PP regeneration, and I can go into more depth in another video talking about the PP regeneration, but the long story short is gunner is burst active PP regeneration, where force is passive PP regeneration. In most cases, force is going to be your choice, primarily depending on the weapon you're using as well as just overall ease of use. Force tends to be the choice itself that you can kind of go with as your safe choice. Gunner is going to be a lot more niche, and you have to have very specific setups to make gunner work very well. But when it does work very well, it works extremely well. That's really all we have to talk about when it comes to class choices. Those are going to be your primary choices. Bouncer as a support class, or a support class, excuse me, as a subclass primarily, is going to just be for uses of jet boots. Classes like Force and Techer don't really have great options while a target is downed. They work fine while your target's moving around and attacking and all that stuff, but its down damage isn't great. In those situations, having Bouncer as a subclass not only synergizes with the class itself because of some things on the skill tree we're going to talk about a little bit later, but it also does very well because jet boots has some insane down damage with being able to use jet sweep, jet intensity. I was going to say jet sweep jolt, but jet intensity being absolutely insane for the damage itself. But yeah, that's really all we have to talk about when it comes to classes. Let's go ahead and jump into the skill trees. So our first skill tree we have is going to be just my usual dual blade setup. Now this is a dual blade only setup. So as far as points go, we start out very easily with our defeat PP gain. I mean, this one's kind of a no-brainer. It's 50 extra PP just for downing a target. It starts your down rotations very nicely, and if you can chain downs, it'll chain into some crazy amount of damage. Of course, you have Fanatic Blade Augment, and Photon Blade PP Recovery. So Fanatic Blade, what it allows you to do is, we'll talk about weapon action a bit more, but it allows you to shoot or to do more damage with your blades for 15 seconds. Now, Fanatic Blade Augment allows you to shoot more blades while Fanatic Blade is active. So normally you would only shoot 2 Photon Blades by pressing your weapon action. With Fanatic Blade Augment, you can shoot up to 6. There is no reason not to get both points in this. It just does more damage. It's really great. And then a Photon Blade PP Recovery. So this is pretty nice, and this is like what I mentioned beforehand, the whole burst PP generation. Having Gunner as a subclass allows for this to happen. So whenever you strike a target, when you land a normal attack on an enemy that's struck by Photon Blades, you regenerate extra PP. This 5% is nice, but it's not really like crazy amount that's going to anything along those lines. You really need to be looking at your subclass choices if PP generation is one of your concerns. Outside of that, I'm going to talk about these 3 skills here. Now, physical decline, the decline skill is just specifically tied to the weapon, so you just get the one that's tied to your weapon. And soaring blades don't use tech, so there's no reason to even look at this. So these 3 skills here, Defeat Amplifier, Partial Destroy Advantage, and Decline Amplifier. I actually rank these in like order of importance. So The most important is getting as much defeat amplifier as possible. It just gets targets down faster. Very, very nice. Now, after that, I actually look at decline amplifier as my next choice. Decline amplifier makes it so you build up stages towards making it easier for you to get your physical or elemental declines, and it affects the entire party. So in my opinion, it's very important to grab because downs are huge bursts of damage. It also gives you a ton of PP back. And of course, because in most cases, if you're bossing, you have fighter as a subclass, it's an extra 15% damage because of defeat advantage. No, I'm sorry, 5% because it's a subclass. After that, you've got partial destroy advantage. Partial destroy advantage is what am I looking for? It's a niche situation. You don't really break a lot of parts on targets all of these days unless you're in a very specific group. Like say you're fighting next, you can break his wings, you can break his tail, but in most cases, players aren't really focused on doing that very much. The most you'll get is like one broken part on Pedis, really, and that's about it. Maybe occasionally you'll get broken parts on enemies that you're mobbing with, but I don't really optimize for mobbing very much outside of having enough PP to just AoE things down. So this is kind of low on the totem pole of importance, but some people opt to drop decline amplifier to 1 point and then put points outside of that. I just don't think it's going to give me an extra 0.6% damage. I don't really think it's worth it over just getting more downs overall. So that's my Soaring Blades tree, and of course, like I said, Gunner and Fighter being the two opportune choices that I would take. Force is really, really great as a subclass, like I mentioned beforehand, for PP regeneration. So in any situation that I'm just going to be AoEing targets down, I just take Force as a subclass. In most cases, it's pretty simple, zero thought necessary. Moving on to Jet Boots, it's mostly going to be same things. For Jet Boots, you're just grabbing all of the Jet Boot skills themselves. Jet Extra Attack allows you to get an extra attack, very simple. Jet Intensity is your hard hitting down damage that costs no PP. You just hold your normal attack. As long as you land every single hit of Jet Intensity, it is a massive amount of damage. But if you are going to miss any hit of Jet Intensity, it is not worth your time. So do not bother going for it if you're not going to land all the hits. So basically, whenever a target's down, don't try to sneak this in randomly. It could be a massive loss of damage for you. Jet Boots Elemental set. Now, the way elementals work with Jet Boots, you can cast a tech, and after you cast that tech, you actually deal elemental burst damage or elemental explosions after PAs. Now, this maintains until you cast another tech or you go into down, basically. I'm not sure if it also maintains between going through areas. I've never really tried that one before personally, but it stays up while you're fighting. So as you're fighting stuff, realistically, you're going to have this up. You don't really need to reapply it consistently. It doesn't just go away, or you're not able to get rid of it very easily, so super cool there. Boot Trick Bounce Counter was actually an interesting one. I didn't realize it had this extra effect on it, but it's your weapon action counter. You press weapon action, you counter. If you press normal attack after you press weapon action, you actually get another hit, which is pretty dope. Jet Sweep Jolt, it's very similar to Tricky Capacitor, and you build it up and you just expend it. It's got a 20-second cooldown, has a big chunk of damage, very, very nice. Funny enough, you're actually able to Jet Intensity into Jet Sweep Jolt. If I remember correctly, it actually builds up enough for Jet Sweep Jolt to be used right afterwards, so pretty cool combination. And Thrust Drive. Thrust Drive is basically just quick cut for you guys who've played base PSO2, but on a technique. Essentially, you cast a tech, you get a quick flash of purple, and you can press a normal attack. And then, of course, we have Elemental Decline, because Elemental Decline applies to Jet Boots, while Physical Decline applies to Dual Blades. And then we have the exact same setup, where Defeat Amplifier is the most important, then Decline Amplifier, and then Partial Destroy, but you can opt to drop 2 points in Defeat Amplifier if you really want to grab Decline Amplifier. That much is up to you. Now, something to be said about Bardablot and Zondeclad, we'll talk more about these when we get to the weapon section, but you do have some choices here. Now, I personally would probably sub Force in most situations for Jet Boots Bouncer, because you're only generating an extra, 5% damage for defeat advantage as a subclass. With Force as a sub, you're able to grab Zondeclad and Bardablot from Force instead of having to grab it on Bouncer. Now, if you do need to grab it on Bouncer instead, you want to sub Fighter or you want to sub Gunner, just drop points in Defeat Amplifier, grab those two skills, and you're good to go. But it's up to you how you decide to go about it. You can kind of adjust it on the fly, but realistically speaking, I would personally just go ahead and sub Force in most cases. If you're gonna do this, we're gonna swap between these two, just go ahead and take the points into Bouncer. It's not really worth swapping trees around, or you can have multiple trees if you're someone who really, really likes Jet Boots that much. Totally up to you. Moving on, we have now, I don't personally recommend going for a dual tree. You can, but it's a personal preference situation. If that's the case, you're going to grab basically everything across the board like we talked about. You got Bartablat and Zonde clad. Again, this is going to be dependent on what your subclass is going to be. And then you take both declines, defeat amplifier first, decline amplifier, and then partial destroy. So that is what I would go with for a dual tree, and I probably would stick to being force sub, to be perfectly honest, so I can drop these 2 points and put them here. But again, that is just my personal preference, 100% up to you. Now, we do have to talk about Bouncer as a subclass because because of how powerful Jet Intensity is. So I mentioned it a little bit earlier in the video itself, but Jet Intensity does so much damage on down targets. It is fantastic for classes that do not have great, huge amounts of bursts on a downed target. So in most cases, the first class I personally thought of was Tekker. Wand is pretty good while the target is up and swinging at you and you have something to counter. However, when the target is downed, your PAs don't really hit that hard. And access to having Bartablat and Zonde clad Bouncer means you can grab what's important for jet boots, which in the case of laying jet boots for just downs, Jet Intensity and Jet Sweep Jolt are all you need. You take Jet Extra Attack because you have to for Jet Intensity. You literally can't not take it. But you don't need to worry about Elemental Set. You don't have to worry about Counter or Thrust Drive. You're not using any of these skills. While the target is up and moving, you're using your wand. When the target is downed is when you're using your jet boots, and you only need to worry about Jet Intensity and Jet Sweep Jolt. One builds into the other. Bam, do tons of down damage. Rinse, repeat. Whenever your target's back up, go back to your wand. You make these into a multi-weapon. They both scale off of tech. Super, super cool. Same thing applies with Force. You're able to do basically the exact same thing, but again, it's up to you. I know this is being done a bit on Bujin timed ability or time attacks, so something to keep in mind. And kind of cool that Tech Bow is back in a different way. Now we're going to go back over to NGS. We're going to talk about the individual weapons. So to start things off, we're going to talk about my favorite weapon, the Soaring Blades. It's also kind of the more straightforward weapon of the two, so it's easier to pick up to start with. Soaring Blades has a very standard normal attack. Its third normal sends out a shockwave in front of it. I think that's kind of cool. It does do damage as well. Pretty solid for PP recovery. Like I mentioned beforehand, your weapon action is Photon Blades. You summon Photon Blades around you and shoot 2 in front of you. If the blades around you don't really do anything, unfortunately. I kind of wish they did, but they don't. You can use this while your character is neutral, while you're gliding, while you're running, while you're photon dashing. You're able to weapon action. There's a little bit of downtime in between when you're able to do it again. I'm actually going to toss this onto my weapon palette really quick so you guys can see. Put it over here. You can see a small internal cooldown whenever it's used. Short amount of time before you can use it again. So pretty nice. Cannot be used during attacks. So if you're using a PA, you can't use the weapon action. Again, wish it were different, but it's going to be a video, that's for a different video at a different time. Start out with its PAs. So the very first one we have available to us is its gap closer called Roaring Pheasant. Now, Roaring Pheasant's pretty dope. It's got 2 major uses. One is a large burst of single target damage while moving towards your target, and the second just being your gap closer itself. So Roaring Pheasant, if pressed just normally, you move towards your target, and then finish a large slash attack. Now, it doesn't just go off. That slash attack doesn't just go off when you reach your target. You have to properly space yourself out. Cool thing about it, though, is you can move past the target slightly and slash the other direction. So you do have the ability to decide what direction that slash goes in. When you do get to the slash portion of it, you are locked into the ability. So be careful about timing and uses and things of that sort. Now, if you press the button again, you will cancel that final slash and just do a huge spin in place. Pretty good if your spacing isn't great, if your target moves, honestly, that's really about it. It's just if your spacing just isn't good, if your target moves. There's a good amount of damage, actually a fairly high amount of damage for a gap closing PA. Second one is going to be Destructive Stork. The Destructive Stork is a bit weird, where it's a great AoE PA. It allows you full movement during the first half of it. Second half kind of locks you in place a little bit. But when you press the button again, it goes from being a really good AoE PA to a really strong single target option. Now, it is still kind of AoE, but like in a vertical line. And you do still have some control over the ability between the attacks. It does quite a bit of damage. But realistically speaking, whenever you're AoEing, you're pretty much just going to Destructive Stork and let this rock all the way through every single time. If, say, you're doing some cleave and there's like one target you need to focus on specifically, switching it over and doing this on that one target is going to be pretty useful. And there's a little bit of splash damage that you get from using it. More like a little bit of cleave, not so much splash, but still pretty solid. And then your final one is going to be Rampaging Harrier. Now, Rampaging Harrier is actually pretty dope. It's basically like Kestrel from base PSO2, where you do a bunch of attacks and then you have a Blade Rain at the end. Cool thing about the Blade Rain is you can, as soon as it starts, you can move into another attack immediately afterwards, and it doesn't really cancel your Blade Rain. Also, Rampaging Harrier is long enough to the point where if you spam it, well, I probably need more PP back. Let's go ahead and do that really quick. But if you spam the ability itself, it's just long enough that the Blade Rain doesn't overlap itself. So you don't have to worry about overlapping with Blade Rain. It's just a long enough PA overall. If pressed a second time, you will cancel into just shooting some blades. So kind of cool. Those blades actually do follow the target. So say your target's like above you, or the target moves back or something along those lines, and you're at the very beginning of this, you can just shoot a bunch of blades out and have it follow. Now, if for some reason your target moves away from you and you're near the end of the PA, so like say moves away right here, don't worry, the Blade Rain actually follows the target about as long as your photon blades are, your weapon action photon blades are. So you do still have a bit of range with this PA itself. If you're near the end of the PA, go ahead and let it rock all the way through. As long as the target's going to sit still whenever it moves away from you, it's very useful. If it's not going to sit still and you kind of can't count on that, then just cancel it. Pretty nice. And last, we have to talk about Fanatic Blade. Fanatic Blade, it's a bit of a weird point for Bouncer, especially for dual blades Bouncer. So for 15 seconds, you shoot more blades. The problem is that you really can't do anything in between because it doesn't really work. Because you can't press your weapon action while you're doing PAs, and there's no animation for Photon Blade specifically. You're basically going to press Fanatic Blade, and you're just going to have a locked on target, and you're just going to try to make sure that all of your blades land on a weak spot. So you can be sprinting around, be running around your target, you can be chasing them, and just doing this the entire time holding weapon action. Now, it's kind of cool from a perspective of chasing your target down, but like when you're in a boss fight, it does seem kind of tacked on and kind of lazy in my opinion. Again, I'm going to talk about what I feel like we should do for weapon action in a future video when I talk about my overall thoughts on Bouncer. And that's really it when it comes to dual blades. Solid weapon, each of its PAs have their uses, and I enjoy it. Oh yeah, and it's got a step counter as every weapon does. It's the only defensive option it has for dealing with incoming damage is a step counter. Unfortunately, whenever you do step counter in the air, it does continue to drop you towards the ground. You don't maintain height like you do with...
What the dog doing?
Oh, let me not hold that. Okay, and moving forward, I'll probably be doing these videos primarily from within one of these cocoons. But as I was saying beforehand, the weapon itself is pretty solid. Again, its step counter does have some issues in my opinion overall, but again, we'll talk about that in a video that I want to do for Bouncer itself. So move on to Jet Boots. So Jet Boots, in my opinion, was Bouncer's better put together weapon. Reason I believe that is it just has more mechanics overall. Now its PAs are a bit weird, but you do get used to them after some time. So Jet Boots has a standard 4-step normal attack because of the extra point that you put in the tree. Pretty useful. Honestly, I don't really find myself using the normal attacks that often, outside of just being in AoE situations. That's where I usually tend to burn the most PP. Outside of AoE, Jet Boots is pretty PP efficient overall. You don't really find yourself hurting too terribly much. Like I mentioned, we have a counter on our weapon action. So if you weapon action ability, it does do a counter immediately. And then you have another counter afterwards that you can press your normal attack for. Let's talk about the PAs. The PAs are actually a little bit more complex than Soaring Blades. The first PA you have access to is Spinning Gust. Moves you towards your target a little bit, does a bit of damage. Basically no animation lock through the entire thing. Very, very nice. Now, Jet Boots PAs change when you hold the ability, and they cost you a little bit of extra PP. With Spinning Gust, it gives you an extra kick at the very end. Kick does quite a bit of damage, pretty powerful. More or less your go-to single target option whenever you're fighting, say like Bujin, or just doing single target damage to a weak spot. Very good option overall. Violent Gale. Violent Gale is a bit of a weirder PA. Just press normally, it allows you to do some kicks sideways, or some AoE style kicks. Give you full control over them. If you press and hold it, it gives you a final kick and pushes you back. Pretty good for positioning, and I believe it does also offer you some guard frames as well. But really, its only use that I have found has been to get me in an almost perfect position for the follow-up PA that I have after this. We have Force Wave. Now, Force Wave, I'm not 100% sure how its damage really stacks up, because in an ideal situation, it's almost too strong. Force Wave just shoots a wave forward towards a target. That little blade sits there and does damage moving forward. But held, you've got a cross of blades that do quite a bit of damage. As far as AoE is concerned, I believe it's kind of king when it comes to AoE. Give yourself some range to deal with if you have to be outside of the range of your target. And realistically speaking, it's just really good. And like I said, if you're using Violent Gale's held ability, it puts you in almost perfect positioning for Force Wave. So I said held ability, but the held version of Violent Gale. Outside of that, really, when it comes to using jet boots, you have jet intensity. Jet intensity, like I said beforehand, it's just more like tricky capacitor. You deal damage, occasionally you just press it. I believe you're fully invulnerable during jet intensity as well. No, wait, not jet intensity. I'm thinking of the held normal. Jet sweep jolt is what I was trying to say. Jet sweep jolt, you're pretty much invulnerable during the ability itself, which is very, very nice. And almost kind of feels unfair in some situations when you're able to use it. And like I mentioned, you have jet intensity. Now, the reason jet intensity, you don't ever want to touch it if you're not landing every single hit, is because of the way it works. I'm going to show you held normal attacks. Now, as you can see, I just keep doing the same kick. That's what happens with jet intensity if you don't land the kick itself. Now, if you do land the kick, you'll start to follow up with kicks back and forth, and they will go faster and faster and faster and faster until you have one final large kick after 15 hits. It is a lot of hits. It does take a while for it to go all the way through, but that final hit is so strong that it's worth all those 15 hits if you can get them. So definitely look into getting that. Definitely worth putting your time into. It is super powerful. And to finalize things out, we can talk about techs. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single tech's use in a broad terminology. I'm just going to talk about its use when it comes to jet boots, because really that's all we care about. You've got all of your elemental techs, Foe, Barda, and Zonde. For Foe, realistically speaking, it's just going to be to apply your fire elemental bursts, and if you need to teleport towards your target itself. So if you need to get that quick cut in and your target's weak to fire, this is a great option to choose. Also okay if you have to be ranged for any specific reason. Nothing too crazy there. Foe does have some nice range options. Barda and Zonde are where things are going to get more interesting. So with Barda, I never personally liked Barda when I was playing Force, but on jet boots, Bouncer Barda is actually super dope. So for the way Barda works with Barda Blot is you cast Barda on your target, and normally if you were playing with a wand or a rod or Talus, you would have to continue to cast Barda, and I believe it's after, I want to say either 7 hits, either 7 or 8, I can't remember exactly. It's fully stacked on its crystals. Afterwards, you'd use a charged Barda or a charged G Barda, and you're able to detonate that hit. It's kind of like a little, almost like a living bomb, except you build it up yourself. Cool thing about using jet boots is because these do elemental damage, or these have elemental explosions, each of your PAs is going to build your Barda Blot. So all you have to do is cast it once, then do a bunch of your PAs, and then just charge burst it. Rinse and repeat. Super, super cool. As far as single target is concerned, it's actually really awesome. It doesn't do a ton of damage, but the amount of damage you get from a target being downed or frozen is going to be much more important overall. And then you've got Jet Boots AoE, which in my opinion is absolutely insane. G Zonde does quite a bit of damage. Now, in an AoE situation, just plopping this down doesn't have it zap everything that's in the circle. Unfortunately, it only zaps one target, but the reason we do this is primarily just to have it in this one location, to have it zap pretty much anything, and to get our element going. Afterwards, we're able to AoE targets. Now, multiple hits of your PA don't build Zonde Clad, doesn't work for Barda Blot or Zonde Clad, but more targets hit with your PA does. And what that means is if you're in a giant AoE situation, you drop down a G Zonde, and you move into casting your Fierce Wave, all the targets you hit with your Fierce Wave are going to build your Zonde Clad. So in most cases, 1 or 2 casts and your Zonde Clad is stacked. You can then charge G Zonde for a ton of AoE damage. Now, alternatively, if you have to be more ranged, you can just use Zondes. Or if you have a single target you need to hit, say like one of the little spots on enhanced enemies, a charged Zonde really takes care of that very, very well. And that's all I have to say about Bouncer. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to toss them into the comments below. anything that I might have missed, any tips that you guys have had itself. But you know, we could get into theory crafting. This video could be an hour to 3 hours long. Thanks for watching all the end, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. Peace out.